Whenever I look at the church today, it seems like all I see is another scandal, no transparency, and churches who just do not live up to their own standards and beliefs. Why do churches lack authenticity? Okay, the question of the day today is this. Why do so many churches lack authenticity? Churches are supposed to be moral, truthful, and trustworthy. So, why do so many churches come across as fake? I really appreciate this question, and for a lot of reasons. One of them being that one of the most essential attributes in the world today is authenticity, and this is the genuine representation of who somebody claims to be. And so when it comes to the Christian church, this lack of authenticity is one of the primary reasons that a lot of people walk away from their faith. I remember hearing a story about a guy named John Wimber. He was the creator of the Vineyard Church movement. And when he became a Christian, he was reading through the Gospel of Matthew, and he was reading about all that Jesus said and did and taught people to do. And so John went to his pastor and he said, "Hey, pastor, when do we get to do the stuff?" And his pastor looked at him and he says, "John, what are you talking about?" And he says, "When do we get to do the stuff?" And his pastor says, "John, you're not making any sense. What stuff? What are you talking about?" And he says, "When do we get to do all the things that Jesus did and taught and told us to do? When do we get to do that kind of stuff?" And the pastor looked at John and said, "John, we don't do the stuff. We just get together and learn about the stuff." And it was at that moment that John had his first encounter with the church lacking authenticity. And it was from there that he started the Vineyard Church movement to help combat the authenticity that he saw in many churches. And this is an experience that I think a lot of us has probably experienced before, where we have recognized that the church wasn't living up to everything that it claimed to be. And not only do we encounter that, but it can be really triggering and cause a lot of hurt and pain when we think that the church is supposed to be one thing and we come to find out that maybe it is living something totally other. Right? And this is kind of the tension that we have to wrestle with. Whenever we encounter a lack of authenticity within the church, do we simply just succumb to that hurt and that pain and walk away? Or is there another option that we can take where we can actually engage the church and engage the problem and help turn the culture around so that the local church could be more authentic? And so this is kind of the disclaimer I want to share with you this morning before we get going into this, is if you feel like you're in a situation that is unsafe and you feel like maybe that situation is in some way harmful to you, I want to encourage you, go ahead and listen to your gut and walk away from that situation, because I know that there are churches out there, they don't simply just lack authenticity, that they are just completely unsafe situations to be in. And so if you feel like you're in a situation like that, man, I just encourage you, walk away from that situation and get whatever it is that you need to feel safe and to become healthy again. But if you feel like your church is healthy, if you feel like your church would listen to you, I want to encourage you to really engage your church in a way that might help steer the ship into a place of a lot more authenticity, to be able to experience a church that is real, that is living up to all of its standards and beliefs, and is being authentic in many, many areas of church life. And so today I want us to just kind of walk through, I want to give you 5 tips on how to engage your church. I think maybe the 5 most common ways that churches tend to lack authenticity. So the first way is this. The first way that churches lack authenticity is that there's a disconnect between what is preached and what is practiced. And so this is my personal opinion. But I am of the belief that nobody chooses to be a hypocrite on purpose, right? So whenever there's a disconnect in a church of what is being preached and what is being practiced, it's my assumption that there's probably a lack of understanding on what is being taught and a lack of clarity on how that is supposed to be lived out. So tip number one is this. You should talk. You should talk to your pastor and be honest about the disconnection and let them know, like, there's a big disconnect between what is being taught and what is being lived out, and encourage your pastors and your preachers and your church leaders to communicate with greater clarity so that more and more people will be able to understand how they are supposed to live their lives out in comparison to what is being taught. The second way that the church lacks authenticity is there seems to be a real lack of transparency and vulnerability. And so the problem with that is when a person presents themselves as being polished and perfect, right, they can come off as unrelatable. And when you become unrelatable, you lack you're just losing the ability to be able to connect with people in a real and authentic way. And so the more lack of transparency and vulnerability you have can really turn into, I don't know, something that's insincere, and it causes people to lose trust in you. And so if a church is lacking transparency and vulnerability, you should encourage the leaders of that church to share real life stories of personal struggle with real life emotions and solutions. This is one of the things that I think a lot of churches really lack, especially from their communicators, is they lack sharing real life stories of how they've gone through the very things that they're teaching about. And they lack the vulnerability to share their own personal struggles. So if you want to see more authenticity and transparency and vulnerability in this specific situation, encourage your leaders just to share real life struggles and stories and share how those real life emotions really lit them up. And just encourage them to be real. The third way I think a lot of churches lack authenticity is there's a failure to address social issues. Now, this is a big deal for younger generations. Social issues are on the forefront of millennial and Gen Z minds through and through. And so when a church fails to address social issues, a lot of times what is happening, communicators are coming across as out of touch and irrelevant. And if a church leader, it seems like they are purposefully ignoring social issues, then they can come across as like being heartless, and not even just heartless. They can also come across as being complicit to the social problem. So what should you do if your church is failing to address social issues? I would encourage you to volunteer and work with your leaders to designate time and space to talk about social issues with the church, and then also make plans to take action on those social issues. So this is kind of the reality of church in general, is you have a pretty good size organization and you have very few people who are present to do all the work. And so if you want to see something more specific happening, specifically around social issues, one of the best ways I can encourage you is to volunteer and get involved. Talk with your leaders at your church and let them know, like, hey, these issues are very, very important, and the church needs to hear their pastor on these issues. The church needs to know how to take action on these issues, and the church needs to know how they can be united and have be unified on these issues. And a lot of times these issues may not be addressed because it's just another thing on the leaders' plates to do. So to have a volunteer come in and say, let me help coordinate all this, is a lifesaver for a church leader. So, and I would encourage you too, if you want to take certain actions, like go to a march or be a part of a rally, and you kind of meet resistance from church leaders on taking any kind of action like that, I would encourage you to come up with creative alternatives, because those creative alternatives, things like, let's go pass out water at a march, right? And so if you're at a march and you're passing out ice water and praying for people, or you could do that as well. You can go to a rally and you set up prayer stations around the way, and people who are at the rally need prayer. You can minister in that way. And so there's all kinds of creative ideas that you can do in order to continue to keep your church involved in the action of these social issues. But sometimes it's going to take some creative, some creative ideas. The fourth thing is this: the church lacks authenticity when it seems like they focus on money more than the mission. And this is heartbreaking, because as things have increasingly inflated and gotten more expensive, churches have essentially learned to spend more and more money. We've seen bigger buildings. We've seen pastors driving nice cars. We've seen all sorts of things where it seems like it's just all about the money. And whenever I talk to a lot of people about why they don't go to church anymore, a lot of them say, "Oh, it's because the church is just all about the money. That's all the church does, is they just want my money." And so when a church focuses more on money rather than mission, they are drastically lacking authenticity within their church. And so here's the step that I would encourage taking. I would bring awareness to the message that is being sent. Let the leadership know that you want to hear more about how to participate in the mission of the gospel and less about giving money to the church. So I don't know if you feel this way or not. I don't know if whenever the church talks about money, you get like a pit in your stomach and you're like, ew, gross. Well, the best way to change that is to really just have a conversation with the leadership and let them know, like, y'all are talking way too much about money. If you need this much money, maybe you've spent too much money. But here's the reality: is they have to be reminded. We don't want to hear about how much money you need. We want to hear about how we are supposed to live out the mission of the gospel in the world in which we live. And if you help give your leadership that reminder, I am pretty confident, because I've seen it before in my own life, that the messages will begin to shift and begin to change, and you will hear a lot more about mission and a lot less about money. The fifth way that the church lacks authenticity is there's a lack of accountability and a lack of action. So there's no shortage in our world of church failure. There is no shortage of church scandal, and it seems like we hear about it all the time. And there is, worse than the church having a scandal, or worse than the church experiencing church failure, is the church trying to cover up that failure. And so this is, I think that's the thing that is the most hurtful to people, is when the church fails at something, and instead of dealing with it and bringing it to light and keeping everybody in the know, what they end up doing is trying to sweep it under the rug, cover it up, and that way they can try to maintain a good reputation or a good image. And so here's my tip for how to handle that situation: is ask your church leaders if they have an action and accountability protocol in the event of a church failure. And so I hate to say it like this, but unfortunately, when you get enough people together in an organization, there is bound to be some kind of element of church failure that will happen. And I wish it didn't. And I know that there are ways that we can prevent many, many things. But just because we can prevent something doesn't mean we can control everything. And so my suggestion is, in the event of any kind of church failure, ask your church, do you have a protocol of everything that you're going to do in case something happens here at the church and there's a scandal or there's a failure? Do you have a communication protocol? Do you have a protocol on how to handle the offender? Do you have a protocol on how to minister to the victims? Do you have a protocol on how to continue to provide healing ministries of like counseling and therapy to congregants who may need it? And do you have a protocol on how to keep everybody together and everybody moving forward and not the church just falling apart? So an action and accountability protocol is very important. And if we want to see greater authenticity in the church, we have to see churches who are willing and ready to take action and accountability seriously. So with that said, authenticity is key for building trust and connecting with people. And so when a church lacks authenticity, it produces an unintended hypocrisy and it fails to love the community in which it serves. And you might think that it is an impossible task to turn this ship around. And it might be an impossible task. But here's what you need to understand and know is that you are the generation that can do impossible things. You have greater reach, greater power, greater information, and greater knowledge at your fingertips than any other generation before you. And you have the ability to do impossible things, to do greater things than any of your parents, grandparents, or anyone before you could ever do. And so if you feel like you lack the confidence and the ability to be able to do something, let me remind you, you are in a position to do greater things than anybody has ever done before. And I want you to try to imagine with me what it would be like what would happen if you would step in and engage a church to try to develop greater authenticity within that church. Then we would have a church that would be practicing what it preached, right? We would have a church that would be transparent and its leaders would be vulnerable and sharing the gospel. We'd have a church that would be front and center ministering in social issues. We would have a church that would care more about mission and less about money. And we would have churches that would have greater action and greater accountability, preventing failures from happening and cutting off scandals before they even start. And if we were to engage churches, if we were to engage our church and help make it more authentic, then we would have churches that we would not want to walk away from. And that, I believe, is one of the most important things about learning how to engage a church to make it more authentic.